1983. I had lunch with Ford Rowan, who was a reporter for NBC television. I believe at that time he was the White House correspondent. He was wonderfully open with me about the process of doing news for a TV network in 1983. And at one point I asked him this question: how do you know when you complete your story that's going to be on the news that night that you got it right? He said, no problem. In my office, I have 3 TVs for what back then were the 3 major news networks. There's me reporting on the White House, another reporter, and another reporter. If I get it the same as the other 2, I know I got it right. 1983. 2018 in the spring. One of my problematic habits, given my professional orientation, is flipping around the news channels to see how they're covering different things. And one night I was flipping around between the 3 big ones in the evening, so-called news channels, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. And it seemed to me like they were not only covering things from a different slant, but they had totally different stories. So, next day I recorded all of prime time, 3 hours on those 3 networks. And over the next few days, I looked at those hours from that one night. There was not one story that the 3 networks had in common. And the slant on the stories they did cover was very different. 1983, I got it right if it's the same. 2018, 3 channels, they couldn't even agree on what the stories were, let alone the angle. 35 years, massive changes. What they had in common across those 3 networks in the spring when I recorded them was a way of picturing the world based on all kinds of opinions. Opinions taken from Twitter feeds, which they would put up on the screen. Opinions especially from experts. All 3 of those networks now have a whole stable of paid experts that they parade through. At least they tell us they're the experts. This is a whole cottage industry. If you want to write a book and successfully get it out, if you want to get on the speaking circuit, get yourself hired as an expert on one of those channels. That will be the beginning of a new career for you. When we look at what's going on now in the digital universe, which includes cable TV, which can be delivered digitally. It includes all the stuff through the internet like Twitter and Facebook, Instagram. It includes all kinds of different news feeds. It includes the search engines, a Google or a Bing or a Dogpile or whatever you use. When you look at the totality of what's going on with communication in this digital universe, I think you see primarily 3 things. And I saw 3 of these in the network that night. One is extreme volatility. The communication is volatile. It's up and down and this way and that way. There's no sustained, prolonged, reasonable contemplation of anything. It's very, very volatile. The whole digital realm is becoming that way. It's also very contentious. It's a contentious world out there. If we could take a snapshot of the digital universe right now and give it to anthropologists 500 years from now, digging up the remains of this culture, they would look at that and say, boy, they were a contentious lot. They love to argue about everything. Nobody seemed to agree. Must have been tough to live back then. Also, that digital universe, the communication is very tribalistic. Now, by tribal, I mean it's in group. What happens in the digital universe is people form themselves into self-interested groups that perceive the world in similar ways. And they gather together to affirm one another that their view is the right view of things. And they consume digital communication products to affirm, confirm their view of reality. It's the many tribes out there in the digital universe, all kinds of them. Often people will ask me today what I think about what's going on with the president, the use of Twitter and everything, and I'm going to say more about that. But let me just say, it's not just one thing. It's not just the political realm. It's all of the realms out there in the digital universe that are like this. They're highly volatile, contentious, and tribal. Somebody will say to me, what about political correctness? Isn't that a big thing? And I'll say, it's not just political correctness. It's all kinds of correctnesses. All of the tribes have their own correctnesses. The political realm is just one. And leadership in this digital universe ends up being more or less the managing of criticism, of incoming criticism. The managing of what's coming in from all of these tribes that don't like what you're about. Whether you're the head of Facebook, or the President of the United States, or a CEO of Google, or a prelate in the Roman Catholic Church, it doesn't make any difference. Any realm you look at, sports, it's all of this incoming criticism. A lot of it because of people being in the digital universe, finding stuff out there that is not compatible with what leaders are claiming is true about themselves and their organizations. I cannot imagine running for any major political office today knowing that people who are not in agreement with you are going to be finding all kinds of stuff in digital archives and slowly letting that out to destroy your credibility over time. But it's happening in all arenas now. Now, as a case study, because this is what people most ask me about, I thought I would talk a little bit about the political realm. And I thought I would zero in on this idea of fake news. It's a wonderful term. I love it. Fake news. Don't you feel good when you can call anybody a fake? It builds us up in our own self-righteousness to call others a fake. You're a fake, you're a phony, you're a hypocrite, whatever. This is part of the digital universe. But it comes in now in terms of this concept of fake news, which is meant to get at the idea of bias. Is there bias out there? Big time. Let me tell you what the bias looks like from my view as a communication scholar. First of all, the bias has to do with persona, with people. The news, the fake news, which more or less is all news now, comes in and centers on interesting persons. The more interesting, the better. It's oriented toward person. Second, it's oriented toward what I call drama or conflict. If there's a little bit of conflict out there, the news media come in and boom, right on it. Then they get all the experts lined up, the different tribal views of the different networks, and they all jump on it. And they take what could be a small amount of conflict, raise it into a big story. And then they tweet about it. And the other people respond to the tweets, and pretty soon a little bit of conflict that was back there between two people, maybe even private, becomes a big, big public thing. And according to the news media, we're facing the end of the world because of that conflict. Persona, drama, or conflict. Interesting thing about these two. I read recently an interview with the three cousins who are up to inherit the New York Times. One of them became the publisher. And in this discussion with them, they said that President Trump has been the best thing for the New York Times because it greatly increased their circulation. People are interested in President Trump. I would say there's persona. If you want an interesting character to cover, to build audiences, get greater subscriptions and so on, could you find anyone better? And he's always getting himself into trouble. Daily conflict. You got it. And these guys from the New York Times said this: it's not a profitable business to put out a newspaper in print form. And sooner or later, they're going to have to go just digital. Not surprising. But they said as long as we have President Trump, we can keep our circulation up, our ad revenue up, and we can delay going all digital. The power of persona and drama in the news. Fourth bias is immediacy. Immediacy. In this fake news realm, everything is immediate. You've got to have the latest. One of the three networks in the evening now has breaking news every 14 seconds. Breaking this, breaking that. It's like watching a video game with all the breaking news graphics coming up. And they've all got the little scroll along the bottom, the text, telling you one news thing that's supposedly the latest breaking news if the one that they're covering in their conversation with the experts is not adequate. It's immediate. It even gets to the point where something happens somewhere, and if it's in a big city like New York where they can get people with cameras down there quickly, they're covering it live, even if it turns out 48 hours later there was nothing to it. But it's live. That's the best immediacy you can have. Historical perspective? Nah. Any kind of perspective beyond the immediate is not nearly as important. And then the fourth kind of bias is what I'll call, parallel to what I mentioned earlier, as a tribal confirmation. A tribal confirmation. So the different tribes out there with their own media, their own groups of followers, tend to have certain perspectives on things. And what attracts people within tribes to particular digital communication is messages that confirm what they believe or want to believe. These tribal outlets are basically in the propaganda business, the self-propaganda business, telling people what they want to believe. I don't care if you look at it from the right, let's say with Fox News, the left with MSNBC, or the middle ground with CNN, which is kind of moving more in a tabloid direction than right or left. It's essentially the same thing. It's a kind of tribal confirmation bias. And what happens within that is it can be very destructive because these tribal media will pick up on a little bit of a story that comes from somewhere, often from a Twitter feed or a Facebook or something. And they'll run with it as if it's true. And then other media will pick up on it. And it'll be rebroadcast through social media and other ways, and pretty soon it becomes a major story. And then when it looks like all of these media that have been purveying this were wrong, they don't come back and say, hey, we got it wrong, gang. They just ignore it and keep going. And so this tribal confirmation leads to some real problems and long-term dishonesty. So leadership in this context, responding with these kinds of biases in the digital realm really is a kind of short-term tribal image management. That's what leadership is becoming. In any kind of institutions you look at, they're monitoring what's going on in the communication sphere and responding. And more of the leadership work, at least in the United States, has to do with responding to what's being reported about you, about your organization, about the industry you're in, the sport you're in, whatever it is. It's response. Tribal image management. And it's interesting that in the media now they talk about this themselves. They talk about people trying to control the narrative. It's a common way that they talk about things themselves. And so the Democrats will say the Republicans are trying to control the narrative, and the Republicans will say the Democrats are. And certain people will say the Russians are, and other people will say the Iranians are. And on it goes. It's this grand battle, supposedly, over managing the narrative. Interesting thing about this is that in the digital realm, if you're creative, if you're really creative about this, you can get around what's often called the mainstream media, the bigger media, the ones that have more clout because of the sizes of their audiences in whatever medium. And I followed the campaign of Donald Trump pretty closely because it's my field. And I was really amazed at what was going on. And what I discovered is he was using digital media more effectively than Barack Obama did when Barack Obama ran. And Barack Obama hired people directly from Facebook to help run his campaign in the social media realm. And then the Trump campaign took it a step further. They said, hey, we don't even need the mainstream media. Who cares about them? We're going to go around them. We're going to do it with a candidate who's very active on Twitter, but who's also very active by going out and doing rallies. So let me tell you a little secret about the rallies, which President Trump is doing right now as we approach the midterm elections. He goes out in different states and has these huge rallies. 10,000, 15,000 people there. 5,000 people waiting outside that can't get in. It's amazing. The president doing it in a midterm election. But what most people don't know is that those rallies are all carried live on the internet through various channels. And so in addition to the people who are at those venues, that's impressive. You also look at the total number of people that are viewing those rallies regularly online, it's phenomenal numbers. That's what he had during the original campaign, and that's what he has right now. If you have a chance, go to a website called Right Side, that's R-I-G-H-T, Right Side Broadcasting. That's the primary one that's doing every one of these rallies live. And what's interesting about it is when a rally starts up, it'll give you, goes through YouTube, you can see the actual number of people watching these. And typically, there's far more people watching them than there are in the actual rallies, which may be 20,000 plus. So we have entered politics in the digital age, just as we have with all of the other areas. Is it good or bad? I can't say. I can say this, as I see where this is headed, the primary form of public communication that's emerging now, the primary form is public relations. Public communication in the United States in all kinds of digital media, for all kinds of organizations in different parts of the economy, in the nonprofit area and all, it's all becoming public relations, the management of narrative, the management of image. And it's just as true in news operations as it is in professional sports or anything else you look at. Public relations. One of the things I do on the side is to go around to universities consulting with their communication programs. What kind of programs to offer where students will actually be able to get jobs? What's the future, where it's headed? And what I say is public relations. Social media related to public relations. That's the future. It's a future that's already emerging, so I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to get it right. We're already well down the road on that. It's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's the gatekeepers, the search engines and the news feeds on Facebook and so on. All of these gatekeepers, part of the public relations. Now let me step back from this a little bit and talk about leadership communication. I said that what's happening is that leadership is being increasingly defined in a reactive way, responding to criticism and trying to plug the holes in the narratives that are falling apart. Real leadership, it seems to me, is very different from that. Real leadership is a kind of stewardship. I'll define it this way. It's identifying, accepting, and acting upon responsibilities in the service of others. It's identifying. What are the needs out there in the world? What are they? The leader identifies real needs proactively. It's accepting. Many of us can identify needs in the world, but we're not in a leadership position where we can accept the responsibilities related to that. Let alone, thirdly, acting upon those responsibilities. This is proactive, and as I say, it's a kind of stewardship. And you can look at it in terms of primarily communication. That is to say, it's through communication that you identify the needs. And it's through a kind of heart transformation that you begin to accept them and act upon them. The acting upon these needs on behalf of other people, let's call those other people our neighbors, requires some skill, some real communication skill. Every leader, it seems to me, in every organization ends up in that situation, whether they identify it as what leadership is or not. That's what it comes down to. And as I have looked at this, I thought to myself, how can I best help students? Many of whom now just are my mentees. Over the years of my teaching, probably the most important thing I did beyond the teaching itself was mentoring students who became former students. I have mentees all over North America. Many of them are in media. When I need to know what's really going on with particular media, most of the time I have mentees in those organizations and I can find out. I can't talk about it publicly necessarily, but I can find out what's really going on. And they come to me and they say, you know, I would like to provide some leadership. There's kind of chaos in this organization. What would that look like, that leadership? Can you help me get a sense of that? I see the needs. I want to do something about it. So, in my mentoring over time, what I did was to come up with things that I take these mentees through. And at some point I said, I'm going to put these together in a book. And now you know the rest of the story. I can't be everywhere at once. So I took 30 of the most important aspects of communication for leaders, all of which address the issues I just talked about, with short readings, one a day. beginning with gratitude as the most important attitude for a communicator, and ending with legacy. What will people say about you when you're gone? And what I'd like to do right now is just talk about three of them. That in this digital age of leadership are three of the ones that I focus on as most important. The first is hospitable listening. Hospitable listening. The digital realm is a realm where everybody wants to express themselves. People want to have a blog, they want to have a Twitter feed, they want to have different Facebook, they want to express themselves. It's the age of individual expression. Everybody wants to have a voice, but nobody wants to listen. It's amazing. You watch these cable news, quote-unquote news channels at night, nobody's listening to anybody. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody wants to express themselves. Very little listening. And the worst listening is cross-tribal. Is anybody at MSNBC going to listen to anybody from Fox or learn from them? No. Not going to happen. Remember St. Francis. Lord, help me to seek to understand others more than to be understood myself. To understand, to stand under. To be humble enough to understand others. There's also a notion out there that communication is agreement, by the way. Expression or agreement. And the agreement one causes all kinds of problems as well. Communication does not necessarily have anything to do with agreement. It's fundamentally about shared understanding, whether or not you agree or not. And so there's this notion in the digital realm that the only way that you actually listen is when you agree. And so people will fight until they can beat down the other person enough to agree or just give up and move on. Listening for shared understanding just doesn't seem to be adequate. It's a sad state of affairs. It's a difference between a fool and a wise person. The fool is the person who speaks, expresses themselves before they know reality. The wise person knows reality first and then speaks. Slow to speak, quick to listen, or as they used to say in some of the monastic traditions, speak only if you can improve upon the silence. Can you imagine dropping that on one of the cable news channels at night, saying, live by this simple rule, speak only if you can improve upon the silence? How much of 45 minutes plus commercials would be left? The opposite of listening really is assuming. And that's what the fool does. Assumes and then speaks. So the digital realm is loaded with foolishness in the sense of people who don't listen, but they love to express themselves. And they love to try to force other people into agreement. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, the idea of listening comes from the idea of being intimate with reality. Or in Hebrew, yada, Y-A-D-A, yada. The Jewish comedians today, use a certain version of that, yada, yada, yada. You know. The problem is that when we assume we know, we might not. And then we speak and we make fools of ourselves. I say hospitable listening in terms of the ancient practice of hospitality. Being hospitable in your heart and your mind to other people's thoughts and ideas and expressions. So when people ask me about fake news and how to operate in this digital realm, I say, well, one thing is you're going to have to be hospitable beyond your own tribe. If you really love Fox News, watch MSNBC one night instead. Keep your mind and heart open. See what happens. What you'll often find, it's not just that the tribal perspectives are different, but the facts that they use are different, but the facts in many cases are facts. One channel ignores certain facts because they're not in tune with its tribal narrative, and the other one does as well. People ask me, well, what about newspapers? What do you do with newspapers in this world? Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Okay. Be hospitable as you listen, as you pay attention to reality here. You interested in politics? Okay, read the Wall Street Journal and read the Washington Post. If it's between the Post and the New York Times, I'll say the New York Times coverage of culture is better, the Washington Post coverage of politics is better. Try them both. Give it a month or so. See what you think. You're going to get different tribal perspectives and different facts. You're going to listen more. You're going to start to be more open about the fact that your tribe may not have it all together. I should say here about the news media in particular that there used to be a distinction between a reporter and a journalist. A reporter was one who gave you semi-objective reporting of facts. That's a reporter. A report. You think of that like a scientific report. A journalist is like someone who keeps a journal and has certain opinions and perspectives that they weave into their stories. Well, what's happened in the last 2 decades is that distinction between journalism and reporting has pretty much evaporated. And I can take any story on any given day from the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and see how their different tribal perspectives are right there in what they claim to be reporting, not on the opinion editorial pages. So it's very difficult to ferret this out today. Second practice for leaders in communication is civil expression. Civil expression. Listening is crucial, probably the most important communication skill, but we also express. We speak, we text, we tweet, we post. What does it mean to do it civilly? To be a person of civility in doing it. What does that mean? What does that look like? That's kind of a lost art. If it's not lost, it's disappearing. It's on the way out. In any of the major digital tribal media out there, it's difficult to find people who are expressing themselves civilly. They seem to lack a kind of politeness. They lack respect for other people, especially those that they disagree with or think they disagree with. People don't want to admit that they might be wrong, or that even in their expression itself at the time, there's the possibility that they're wrong. I could be wrong, but here's how I think about it. You don't hear that much. Instead, it's boom, 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 boom. I admit in our state as human beings, we all feel a little bit of gladness in being able to point out when other people are wrong or we think they're wrong. We do like to put down other people, to make fun of them. We like it. It's part of human nature. What the digital realm does is to take that and amplify it. So instead of just having the thoughts about somebody out there we might not even know that's in politics or sports or business or whatever, instead of just having the thoughts, we express it. The best example of what I'm talking about in the digital realm is the comment section under articles online. Take any of the news organizations or other major websites where they allow comments down below from people. Do it on YouTube or anything. And look at the comments by people. Do you want to see disappearing civility? That's the place. And of course, it affords a degree of anonymity as well, because you can do this in some made-up name. You don't have to use your own real name. So you can say those things that in the past you might just think and not express publicly. The nastiness, the vitriol, the damaging things that are put out as if true. This would not worry me so much, except it's widespread and we are imitative beings. We are imitative beings. We tend to communicate like those that we communicate with. There is within us something where to be accepted or loved, affirmed, when we start to hang out with, whether it's online or in person, people who have a very nasty, critical way of communicating, we become like that. And so a lot of these pockets of tribal communication online are pockets of nastiness where civility is just disappearing. The last aspect of communicating as leaders in this digital age that I would like to talk about is long-term visioning. Long-term visioning. Casting a vision with and for an organization as a responsibility is a very important thing. Whether we talk about a college or a business or government or whatever, where are we headed? Somebody has to paint pictures for us using words and logos and so on. That's where we're headed. Somebody has to tell the stories of the past that will help us move into the future where we need to be. This is extremely important. The digital realm, as I've painted it for you, is a very short-term place. It's reacting to all of the stuff that's going on out there, especially the criticism directed at you and your organization. And it's fear of what's going to happen in the next quarter or the next election. Long-term visioning evaporates. It evaporates. And we all tend to think shorter term. And we want quick fixes for things, and we get impatient when we don't see them. Long-term visioning is a kind of servant orientation to help people together move from now into the future, with that future defined in a way that is really good for people. It's right, it's fitting, it's good. It's beyond the current fads and fashions of thought, which are whipped up by the tribes. And it's increasingly difficult to find leaders who have the time, the energy, the capacity, the staff in a digital realm to be able to do this. I was invited to speak on Capitol Hill in a public setting. People from different parts of the government came. There were people from the Defense Department, the Department of Justice, and congressional aides, all kinds of different folks there. It was fun. I spoke about leadership. And my point was that leadership is a long obedience in a right direction. It's not short term. Well, some congresspersons asked to meet with me privately. Off the record. It was about a dozen. And I sat down in a meeting room with them. The first person said, I can't tell you who any of these people were, but the first person said, "What you say is impossible. It will never happen. What we're about is the next election." In a massive criticism, in a very unstable communication environment, we're just trying to survive. And the parties can't get along, and you think that a long obedience in the right direction is something that we can do. It was one of the most depressing conversations I've ever had in my life. I left that meeting wondering, is there hope for government at that level in this country? I have 3 television sets, Ford Rowan says. I know I got it right when the other 2 agree with me. So I tape, video record 3 networks, almost complete disagreement about what to cover and how to cover it. And then these congresspersons say to me, long-term thinking is not going to work here. It's what we have to do today and tomorrow. That's the digital universe we're in right now. Thank you.